Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Pay Equity, an Introduction to Fair Pay Practices in the Public Sector. Our presenters today are Vicki Quintero-Brashear, the Director of Products and Services at CPS HR Consulting, and LaShawn Ross, who is an HR consultant with CPS HR. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few pieces of information about the webinar. To avoid interruptions to the presentation, all attendees are in listen-only mode. You can still ask questions via the Q&A box in the webinar dashboard, and we'll make every effort to address your questions at the end of the presentation as time allows. Today's presentation is available on the CPS HR Consulting website and as a handout in your webinar dashboard. We'll also forward a link to all of today's attendees once the recording is available for viewing. And now I'll turn the presentation over to Vicki and LaShawn.
Great, thanks, Julie. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are this fine day. Thank you for joining us for our webinar. I will be assisting LaShawn as we go through the presentation, primarily with the polling questions. And before we started, I wanted to give a shout out to two of our consultants who really did the heavy lifting in terms of the research needed to prepare for the webinar, as well as the slides. That would be Lena Ray and Justin Tucker in our compensation and classification division. So thank you both. They're probably listening right now. And I'd also like to thank LaShawn Ross, who is our presenter today. I'm actually going to turn it over to her now to provide a quick introduction and get us started into the webinar.
Thanks, Vicki. Good morning, everybody. As Vicki and Julie said, my name is LaShawn, and I have spent the entire of my career in local government. 28 years, retired in 2016, spent the majority of my time in human resources and a large part of it in city management. So I'm really excited to be able to talk to you all today about this idea of pay equities, which seems to be a really growing topic today. So let's just jump right into the presentation and use this next hour to really get into some important aspects of this topic. So pay equity and managing actually all aspects of compensation is really a balancing act. There are laws and governing agencies, there's budget management, and there are all other kinds of variables that we have to consider around pay equity. And the key is that we should not allow ourselves to get too worked up about it, because it really is a very familiar topic to us. So yes, laws change and demands on employers may be increasing, but taking a well-researched, methodical approach to responding to these issues will be the thing that will really make the difference between us feeling overwhelmed and simply taking the necessary steps to comply. So you'll hear me use the word simply probably several times today, because I hope that that will really start to replace any fears and any thoughts of being overwhelmed by this topic. It's something that's very familiar to us, and it's just a matter of strategizing what we need to do. So let's continue to move forward into our discussion. This next slide actually shares just a quote here that seems really very reasonable for us. It says, "We will never have true civilization until we have learned to recognize the rights of others." And how is this relevant to what we're talking about? Well, pay equity is simply about fairness. I think that we all know that. We can quote statutes, we can have fears about deadlines, and we can hope that audits will never actually happen. But if we will do the work to ensure that we have equitable practices and policies in place in our organizations, the goals will be accomplished. It really is, at the end of the day, all about equal pay for equal work. So please let's keep that in mind as we move forward and talk about the learning objectives for today's webinar. So there's navigating through the pay equity roadmap, knowing where to go, how to get there, where we're going, and then knowing how to ask the right questions. So this webinar is designed as an overview to highlight that pay equity continues to be an ongoing conversation that's certainly gaining national attention as a topic of high importance. This is not a new topic, but over 55 years of regulations and conversations still haven't brought us to the place where we can say that all of these objectives have been attained. So today, we're going to share a framework that will allow each of us to sort of go back and fill in specific needs and goals for our own organizations. It's going to come down to knowing the right questions to ask. And what that's going to do for us is that it's going to allow us to set the goals that we need, to determine strategies and action plans for our organizations and the employees that work within our organizations. And it's also going to lead us to creating an implementation plan. So once we've done those things, we have the goals, we know what we're doing, we're setting a plan, then it's simply about activating that plan and making sure that it works in the best interest of our organization, in the best interest of our employees, and also allows us to put systems in place that guarantees or helps us to guarantee and show that we are certainly working towards having a compensation that is equitable for all employees within our organization. So going on to the next slide, we're talking about why we should even care about pay equity. And I think that certainly as human resources professionals, compensation professionals, wherever we find ourselves in terms of being in leadership roles with working with people, we understand this term equity, whether we're talking about pay, we're talking about employment, we're talking about ability status, we understand pay. So it's all about us activating these things in all of the processes and policies and procedures that we use within our organizations. So when wages reflect the productivity, the skill, the competencies, and the experience of the individual, then we're going to get those efficient outcomes that we're all looking for. It's about us making those good faith efforts to put those systems in place that we've just talked about in terms of having a methodology and a system to ensure pay equity. And we certainly have to pay attention to the laws that have been on the books for years, and the new laws, the amendments that are happening. There's pending legislation, there's new laws, there's old laws. All of these things, there are administrative agencies. All of these things are perhaps making it easier for people to know about these pay equity concerns and to file those claims, but it also helps us as employers and professionals to make sure that we are doing the necessary review within our organizations to ensure that this compensation equity is occurring. So one of the things that we want to do as part of this webinar is to give the attendees the opportunity to think some of these issues through. That's going to come in the form of questions, and I'm going to turn it over to Vicki right now so that she can lead us through our first question.
Great, thanks, LaShawn. So our very first question has to deal with your priority level for such a study. So what priority level does pay equity currently hold within your organization? And we've given you all a couple of options, actually 4 options to indicate the priority level. We're talking high priority, medium, we could be doing more, we keep meaning to, but it's not our highest priority, and our 4th option, not on our radar. So if you all would be so kind as to indicate one of those responses to our question, we would love to have the feedback and know where the group is at the moment.
Okay, responses are coming in pretty quickly, so we'll give it about another 10 seconds and then we'll close it up and take a look at our responses.
Okay, another 10 seconds then.
Okay, there we go.
All right, we're going to close the poll and
share the results.
Share the results. So you all should see this on your screen. Looks like 29% of us have this at the highest priority, and a good 46% are at the medium priority. We could be doing more. It's kind of nice to see that fewer of us are on those bottom 2 choices. It's not the highest priority and not on our radar, and there's probably obvious reasons why in this current day and time this is such a high priority for all of us as employers. Okay, great. Okay. Thank you for that feedback, and we're going to move on to the rest of the webinar. We'll have one more question in a few minutes. Go right ahead, LaShawn.
Thanks, Vicki. So it's interesting, as I'm looking at those results, I think it makes perfect sense. When we look at organizations across our states, in our nation, you know, we have so many things on our plates at any given time. And I feel that pain for the attendees who are probably here today participating in this webinar. And so many times, until something actually becomes a problem, we just don't see it as something that we might have to put a lot of resources behind or spend a lot of time with or do quite a bit of research. But the good news, again, is that as we talk about our regular policies and practices in our organizations, equity should be common to all of those things. So as we are doing our due diligence to review policies and procedures and look at practices and talk to stakeholders about what's going on in our organizations, there are probably opportunities along the way that we can take to consider pay and think about what's going well and maybe whether there are some things that are in need of attention. So the fact that, you know, many of us say that we could do more, I think that all of us probably always could. So around this idea of distribution of compensation that's blind to an employee's sex or race or color or religion or national origin, those are just the things that we're supposed to be doing anyway. So regular review of our practices and policies just helps us to make sure that that is exactly what we're doing. So an important key to establishing and maintaining pay equity is to ensure that the factors used to establish pay rates in the first place are actually based on objective criteria, that it's related to job assignments, performance requirements, and the employee's or the applicant's competence to perform. When we focus our attention on those things, it keeps those merit-based factors in front of us so that we don't slip into considerations about sex, race, color, religion, and national origin. So when we're appropriately focused on performance, on skill sets, and the equitable distribution of pay and benefits and fairness in compensation, then all of these other things should largely take care of themselves. Am I saying that it just happens and it's always going to be super easy? No, I'm not saying that. But I am saying that when we give it its due attention and when we practice fairness and equity at all times in our policies and practices, regardless of the topics that we're talking about, we have a better opportunity to show that the organization is committed, its leadership, its practices are committed to, if we can say, doing the right thing on behalf of all employees. So to go on to talk about dimensions of equity in our next slide, I know this is something that we're probably all familiar with. It just goes on to explain a little bit more about how we consider these dimensions of equity, what things we should be thinking about. So with external compensation equity, which is something that we would typically do when we're looking at our compensation plans and conducting studies and surveys, we want to know, are employees in an organization compensated at rates that are consistent with external labor market? Again, these are things that we're just going to do anyway to try and make sure that we are keeping a compensation and plan that in place that is actually competitive and that we're paying our employees as they should be paid, and that we can retain them and attract new employees. The internal compensation equity asks us the question, is a particular employee paid fairly in comparison to his or her similarly situated peers? And this is where we find a lot of the discussion around pay equity. It is about if we have two people that are doing similar jobs, whether they are of different races, whether they are of different genders, are they being paid similarly for the similar work that they're performing? And then there's the group compensation equity that takes us to the question of, are employee groups paid equitably in comparison to other employees? And we would use the same basis as we talked about for the internal compensation equity question. So again, these are things to keep out in front of us as measuring tools to make sure that we are doing well along the way and that we don't find ourselves on the outskirts in problematic areas down the road, and we look back and can't quite figure out how we actually got there. So, of course, when we have all of these rules and laws and expectations, as we look at the next slide, it brings up the idea of enforcement. And it's interesting to think about all of these pieces of legislation that have come about since 1963 that have been addressing the very topic that we're talking about today. It's been the persistence of discriminatory pay practices that's been the subject that has caused us to see all of these different types of legislation. It's been an extensive debate over the years, and there have been many legislative attempts to help level the playing field. We've got the Equal Pay Act of 1963 that really addressed equal pay for equal work, and that was the language there to address gender-based discrimination. There were even iterations of that talked about, are we really saying comparable work? And for this legislation, we were talking about equal pay for equal work, and we still see that terminology used today. Then just in 1964, the next year, there was Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that prohibits compensation on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, national origin, age, or disability. So it was expanded, still trying to keep us on track to be sure that we are measuring compensation and assigning compensation in the way that we should. There was the Executive Order 11246 that mandated non-discriminatory practices in federal hiring and contracting. There's the Age and Discrimination Employment Act of 1967 that went on to talk about age and not having discriminatory practices for people who are 40 years of age or above. There's Title I of the American Disabilities Act of 1990 that prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in services and programs and activities that are provided by state and local governments. And then more recently, there was the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009, which actually addressed time limitations for when an employee can sue for discrimination. The interesting thing about the Ledbetter Act is that it determined that each paycheck that contains discriminatory compensation is a separate violation, regardless of when the discrimination began. So there's no time limit for suing employees because each paycheck is issued, each time a new paycheck is issued, it's not limited to the original discrimination date. I think that this should probably encourage many of us to be certain that our pay structures are in place early on so that we're not seeing these separate violations each time a new paycheck is issued. That would be important to consider. So as we go on to the next slide, it takes us even a little bit further to talk about what we're seeing more recently in the last year or so on salary history bans, saying that prior salary history cannot be used alone or in a combination of other factors to justify a wage differential. We're seeing these in California, Delaware, Massachusetts, Oregon, and Puerto Rico. So I would suggest certainly to any of us that we look at our own state to determine what is more specific to what we need to be doing in our organizations for compliance purposes. But if we think about the Ledbetter Act and then we look at the salary history ban, it seems to be aligned in some respects in that if the pay was discriminatory to begin with, then down the road, it is going to continue to perpetuate itself until we correct it. And this is, again, the importance of doing regular reviews on our salaries and compensation plans. So then we go on to the Paycheck Fairness Act of 2018. Again, it is not for lack of legislation that we have not been able to maybe reach some of the goals that have been set around pay equity and fairness. But in fairness to all of us in the employment world, there are so many variables at play. I don't know that it's usually possible to just look at salaries alone and determine that discrimination has occurred. There are so many other variables that have to be considered. So even in light of all of this legislation, it stands to reason that many of them will address separate components of pay, but we have to pay attention to all of them to make sure that we are on the road to compliance and fairness. So this Paycheck Fairness Act of 2018 has actually reportedly been introduced in congressional sessions for over 10 years. So in addition to increasing penalties for employers who pay different wages to men and women for equal work, this act would also provide for additional training and recognition programs. That's something that isn't actually shown. Here's one of the bullets, but as we read further into the language, I thought it was important to bring that out because it's not just about dinging and fining. It also offers opportunities to improve those pay inequities and those practices within organizations. It has not been finalized. It is not yet on the books. It would be an extension of the Fair Labor Standards Act and the Equal Pay Act. But the difference in 2018 as opposed to previous years for congressional consideration is that there is such broad attention given to this topic of pay equity. And so we have to question, what will be the result this next time of consideration? Might it be passed? Well, of course, we don't know, but it certainly seems that the environment is right for strong consideration of this type of legislative language. So let's
Absolutely.
go on to talk about. I'm
sorry, LaShawn. I just wanted to add a quick addendum to all of this. There's a huge growing momentum at the state and city level to enact pay laws. And as a result, many states and big cities are really kind of pushing through very aggressive pay equity laws that differ and contradict each other. So while we're giving you a snapshot in time today, there's a pretty strong likelihood that the landscape's going to be changing in the next months, years, but definitely changing. So this is something that we all need to keep ahead of and in constant contact with our attorneys and studying up on. Just wanted to add that, LaShawn.
Thanks so much, Vicki. That's really important, and I'm glad that you actually mentioned staying in touch with the language in these legislative pieces, as well as working with attorneys. It'll be really important that we access stakeholders that have command of this language and can help organizations and us as professionals to better understand what's at stake and what we need to do and what the consequences might be. We're not certainly just trying to find out, how do we not get fined? No, we're talking about how do we put the best processes in place so that that type of attention from a fine standpoint is not even something that we're worried about, but it is certainly a huge topic and requires a lot of attention, and it won't get done in the hands of just one person within any organization. It's going to require a great deal of work from a team of stakeholders that understand the importance of this topic. So when we talk about the I'm sorry, Vicki, did you have something? No?
Go right ahead.
Okay, thank you. So the enforcers of this discussion, when we talk about pay equity, Equal Employment Commission and the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Program. So the president, our current president's budget proposal for 2019 has led to a much more focused use of effort and dollars. So both the EEOC and the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs will commit available funds to expanding assistance to contractor compliance and then even giving more attention to systemic discrimination cases. They've been told that, they need to use their dollars wisely where it's going to make the most difference. And I think we're going to see these two agencies really looking at the systemic discrimination cases. I think that's the word for us to search for. Where it's systemic, and impacting possibly a lot of people. And we can understand that occurring because we certainly know as employers that that is not the goal. We talk about fairness in the workplace, and that's what we want to achieve. So the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs will look for base pay and pay component data to determine whether there's concern for systemic pay issues and a possible audit. So we highlight those two things because it means that we really need to be paying attention to how are we establishing base pay, and then how are we reviewing pay components that then support base pay or help base pay to grow. How do we get to those ultimate total compensation numbers, and how do we demonstrate fairness across the board? The remedy is to stay ahead of these agencies by doing our work, by reviewing our pay practices, by analyzing our pay data regularly, and then reviewing and updating our policies regularly in a way that we know what's going on in our organizations, that we understand how we're addressing compensation. We know how we're assigning pay. We're looking across departments and functions to be sure that there is continuity in terms of how that pay is getting assigned. So, you know, the word for the day again is just going to be pay attention. We have to pay attention to our policies and our practices, and we have to be aware of what our governing agencies are telling us that is most important. If we stay ahead of those things, if we equip ourselves with that knowledge, get the right stakeholders at the table, pay attention to the right levels of review, and take action at the time that it should occur, I think we are going to be substantially ahead of the curve. So having said that, I'm going to turn it back over to Vicki for our next question.
Okay, thank you. All right, our next question is, how prepared is your organization to conduct a pay equity study? How prepared are you? And the choices are, we're on it, we're actively conducting, we are preparing now or will be in the next 6 months, it's on our radar for 6 or more months out, or finally, we're not prepared and no study is being planned. So we'll give you all a few seconds to select one of those options, and then we'll talk a little bit about those results. Looks like people are responding.
One starting to, one down a little bit. Okay,
we're going to close the poll. Okay, so about 26%. Oh, wow, that's really a lot more than I was expecting. That's great. We're on it. We're actively conducting. 20%, so almost half the group is either doing it or preparing for it in the next 6 months. And then we have another half of the group is on our radar. And then 32% not prepared and no study is planned, which is probably why you're joining in on this webinar. So happy to have you. Hopefully we'll be able to answer some of the more practical questions at the end of the webinar, and we will continue on. LaShawn, go right ahead.
Okay, thank you. So then with regard to those responses, for those of us who really don't have the slide of pay equity study, are we prepared? Again, if we think about skill, effort, responsibility, working conditions, these are all things that we're going to consider when we're developing our job descriptions, when we're looking at task analysis to support those job descriptions. So as we consider our levels of preparedness to explain or to defend pay equity within our organizations, let's just be careful not to focus so intensely on compliance that we forget that effective compensation management is just simply part of our jobs, and it is what we do. And so when we give attention to how employees are paid, we are going to naturally reap the benefits of broader results, such as reduced staff turnover, reduced risk of legal claims, which is largely what we're talking about here today. And then it gives us access to a broader talent pool, and it certainly helps to improve the morale and productivity and helps us to develop a more positive reputation and brand for our organizations. So with the pay equity studies, whether we're prepared today or not is not anything that's going to destroy our being able to move forward. It just means that we have to assess our level of readiness for what we're going to do, where we are, and how we're going to plan to get there, and to certainly consider all of the systems that we already have in place that will help us to determine that strategy. So moving on, are we prepared still with job analysis, job descriptions, job evaluation? Let's not overlook that much of what we need to establish reliable compensation systems that promote pay equity and put those structures in place to maintain pay equity might already be in place for us if we're actually being attentive to the accuracy of our job descriptions. Job task analyses should support requirements in job descriptions, and then the ongoing job evaluation should provide a process to keep us on task so that these documents that we're talking about here, the job analysis, descriptions, and evaluation, along with those compensation policies, really do provide a basis for justifying and explaining all of our compensation decisions. And if there's one thing for us maybe to note regarding this topic today and everything that we're discussing, is that it comes down to us being able to explain why our compensation structures are as they are. How can we explain that the compensation is fair and equitable across the board? And then how can we justify what is in place? So it'll be each of these steps, each of these documents, each of these processes that will help us along the way to explain those to an enforcement agency, to explain to our employees, to help them to trust that we are doing the best thing for all involved. So going on to continue that question of are we prepared? What are some factors that explain differences in pay, and how is pay determined? Well, that's probably a topic that we already know quite a bit about. Discovering that there are gender gaps in our organizations at one or more levels does not necessarily mean that discrimination exists, but it does mean that these gaps need to be analyzed so that we can demonstrate whether they're explainable and justifiable, both explainable and justifiable. It's one thing to explain why gender pay gaps or gaps of any other kind exist, but it's another thing to actually explain why they persist. So a good reason for us to conduct these reviews and look at our practices is that we want to determine whether there is any evidence of discriminatory pay practices and pay inequity, so that we can demonstrate when we discovered them, then we took the necessary steps to correct them. So just because gaps, though, can be explained does not mean that they can be justified. So that is a two-part question. A well-constructed analysis, a pay analysis, will answer both of these questions for us. So then we can determine what the next step should be. This does not have to be an overwhelming task. In fact, this type of review should be just part of our normal processes, as we talked about earlier, to ensure that operational processes and policies are actually supporting the organization's objectives. So going on to the next slide, we're talking about what are the factors that explain differences in pay, such as our formal pay policies, our compensation strategies, our performance management. We should think about the fact that building the business case for pay equity is a really critical step toward securing leadership's understanding and support for dedicating resources to this effort around establishing and maintaining pay equity. We want to make sure that we can explain why this is important. And many of the things that we've talked about today should contribute to that story that we can then tell to the leaders in our organization in terms of how we craft our policies and practices and processes to support both employees and compliance for these enforcement agencies. In our organizations, what we believe to be important tends to be prioritized. So that's another reason that we want to keep this information out front. Concerning pay equity, we should begin by aligning our policies, our strategic initiatives, and performance management processes with our compensation objectives. So surely all of us embrace the concept of adopting policies and practices that are fair and that are to be equitably applied to all of our employees. So it's simply, again, a matter of beginning with the end in mind, to borrow a Stephen Covey concept. If we know where we're going, then we should be able to structure our processes and practices accordingly in making sure that our pay systems are equitable. So are pay differences explainable and justifiable? Well, that's why we do the work. That's why we do the analysis, to be able to determine whether they are and what steps we need to take. Some affirmative defenses, some things that can help us when we do find that maybe there are gaps in pay, some things that will affirmatively defend us and our organizations are seniority systems that are well explained and that we have followed, and we can show why these are necessary and how they're used and how they are not discriminatory, but have a bona fide need within the organization. This would be the same for merit systems, for a system in which earnings are clearly linked to quantity or quality of production, and then a job factor other than sex, such as it being shift differentials or educational requirements. Again, the thing to remember here is that we don't want to just look at these things and say, oh, well, okay, we have some affirmative defenses over here that we can use. We still have to remember those two terms, explainable and justifiable. We have to be able to explain why it's happening, and then it doesn't end there. Once we explain what has happened, then we need to be able to justify whether it should continue in that way or if it's time for us to make a change. So in all that we've talked about today, you know, where do we go? Where do we go from here? What do we do? What do we do next? So here's some ideas for you. You want to determine the project team. We talked earlier about the fact that we want to make sure that we have the right stakeholders on the team, the right people involved in this conversation, because this is not just a task-oriented topic. It really does require leadership commitment, organizational commitment, commitment of resources and effort to make sure that this becomes part of the culture of the organization. We want to identify relevant pay factors. Which ones should we use? What should our data set be comprised of? We want to establish employee groups. What are we going to look at and why? Develop and apply models to data set for similarly situated employees and groups. We've talked about that a little bit earlier. And then tie in the research to what we're doing internally, and then take those next steps. When you conduct this level of review, and hopefully we're doing a little bit of it each day, each week, maybe monthly, but we want to be able to take that information, summarize our findings, and then outline any gender gaps and themes that emerge that certainly require our attention. We want to document explainable reasons for these gaps. So it does take some time, it takes some effort, it takes some energy, it takes some knowledge of what we're looking for, but the return on investment is probably multifold. And again, we don't want to just look at this for compliance purposes, which is extremely important, but it's also important to make sure that we are doing the fair and equitable thing for employees. We want to document those reasons, and then we want to make a list of all that cannot be immediately explained or justified. This will not be an overnight type of answer. We will discover information that we'll need to address in a long-term sense. We may discover information that needs a very short-term and immediate approach, but it is not to be expected that this is something that we go in, we analyze, we put together a list, and then we package it and put it on the shelf and it's done. This is part of our ongoing review of making sure that our systems are serving our organizations well. So since we don't want to leave any stone unturned in any of this conversation around pay equity, we'll want to also include gaps at base pay and total remuneration. So as we talked about the Lilly Ledbetter Act, and we talked about how we're looking at multiple violations potentially for discriminatory pay for each time that discriminatory pay check is issued, it is so important to look at that also from a perspective of how our benefits and other things that go into the total compensation structure we need to take a look at those as well, because wherever there might be discrepancies or disparities in pay based on discriminatory type findings, we want to make sure that we're addressing that. So we want to pay close attention to these things, and once we make these discoveries, we want to take action. As we're summing up, before we'll have time maybe for a couple of questions, there's the pay equity study review of everything that we've talked about today. This has been quick. We hope that we've given a lot of information that will give you some things to think about. Again, this was intended as an overview that will establish a framework that will allow you to now go and fill in some of the blanks about what specific needs are for your organization. So as you continue the compensation discussion with your various stakeholders in your organizations, remember that pay equity is not a task to be completed. It is not just something that we're going to get done. It is a concept to be woven into the fabric of our operations, and I'm sure that it already is, but it certainly requires our ongoing attention. So yes, managing all aspects of pay is task-focused, but there's a relational component that's also driven by employers deciding what messages they want to send to all employees regarding their value to the organization. It's not just about the compliance. It's what are we saying to employees? Why should they trust that we are looking out for their best interests? And when we assign pay to them, it is because we have looked at what is fair and equitable and what the market bears and what we're asking for in terms of their effort and knowledge and expertise, and saying this is what we believe to be fair, and we can defend it because this is the work that we've done to establish why it is fair pay. So statutes and agencies that enforce these things also have components of education for us. It's up to us as to whether we're going to access these agencies from a reactive standpoint or a proactive standpoint. Of course, we think that it's best that we be proactive and that we do our own homework and determine what the needs are, and that we then reach out to appropriate agencies for assistance and information and support in making sure that these things are getting done and that all of our actions are serving our organizations and our employees well. So having gone through that very quickly, hopefully there was good information in there that will be helpful to you as you go back and continue this work around equitable pay. That is going to close out the content from our slides. And I know that Vicki now has opportunities potentially for the next few minutes for us to field some of your individual questions on this topic. So Vicki, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, great. We have actually received a number of questions during the webinar and then in the weeks leading up to the webinar. So while we would love to answer all of the questions today, we likely won't be able to have time for them. However, LaShawn and I and the team here in Sacramento will endeavor to answer those and send out a communication to the webinar attendees in the coming week or so. So a couple of the questions, we've seen some common themes here, and LaShawn, I'm going to read one or two questions, and then I'll ask you to respond if you don't mind. The first question, okay, great. How can classification and compensation studies even the pay disparities among protected classes?
Okay, that's a good question, and one I think that comes up quite a bit because it's always on the front of our minds about, okay, we've got all of these statutes and laws that are protecting certain groups of people. What do we do about that? I'm going to go back first and say that the important thing for us to remember, again, is not to necessarily be alarmed, but to make sure that we're paying attention to our structures, our practices, our policies, how we're assigning pay, and how we're making decisions. How well are we training decision makers to make these same decisions? Having led in that way, I would then go back to more specifically answer the question and say that these classification and compensation studies are helpful when we're talking about addressing these disparities among protected classes, because the studies themselves are going to help us to review information that's relevant to this question. It's going to help us to look at what are the factors that we're using to assign pay. What are our policies looking like? What do we say about how pay gets assigned? Have we looked at similarly situated groups and individuals in terms of employees to make sure that we can explain why the pay is as it is? And through this type of detailed analysis, when we're doing these studies, it's going to help us to be better able to consider several things. First of all, we'll be able to look at market values. We'll be able to consider what our internal pay rates look like, and are they fairly distributed across the organization. We'll be able to answer the question of how our pay compares within departments, within job titles and groups, and then how our policies and practices either supporting what we're saying that we need to do to be fair around pay and compensation and hiring and retention, and even maybe around promotion, or are these things negatively impacting our compensation goals? We really, really have to pay attention to our policies. I know that we are all so busy, and we can put our policies in place and not pick them up maybe annually or biannually as we should, and review them for relevance and fairness, simply because our schedules are so full and there's no crisis at the moment, or maybe the crisis is someplace else. But it is so important that we either find a way to do this ourselves, find a way to delegate it to the appropriate staff to make sure that we are conducting these studies, we're conducting these reviews, because it's what's going to prevent us from getting down the road and finding ourselves in a crisis. We will conduct these studies along the way, and it'll help us to understand and see whether there are any concerns or any disparate impact with regard to pay. So I think that these classification and compensation studies are really important for a multitude of reasons, and we just need to find a way to review those data points that come from those studies.
Great, thanks. Okay, this next question I'm actually going to answer, LaShawn. We've heard a little bit of wondering about how do you plan to attack the pay gap, because we know they exist, but we really don't know how much funding we'll need, and how do you plan for it? How do you get there without asking for a tremendous budget increase in a single year? So what SHRM recommends is considering an equity reserve, keeping an equity reserve off the top of your payroll adjustment budget, so that you can use some of those funds to partially close a parity gap each time you have your pay cycle increase. And they even go so far, SHRM even goes so far as to recommend that when you have, when you're making these pay adjustments to close the gap, you don't necessarily need to announce it as a remedial action, but you can make the pay increase under the radar as part of the employee's annual pay raise. LaShawn, anything you wanted to add to that?
No, well, maybe just this, just to, as a reminder again, I think that those things that you said are really important, Vicki, and we need to pay attention to those things, but just to kind of take us back to that regular review, helping to maybe offset getting ourselves to a point where we have to do a lot of work. So if we're paying attention along the way and doing the review on a regular basis, maybe we can spot some things that have not become so big, so they are much more minor at that point. And I think also to be able to show any governing enforcement agency that even if there are some issues that exist that still need to be corrected, if we can show our due diligence as an organization that we were working really hard to become aware of these things, and we've done the studies and we're putting processes in place to address them, and we have a long-term strategy that might be over multiple years to be able to address it at its core. From a policy and practice standpoint, I think that speaks very well for us. So that, in addition to those things that you said, to have that plan and perhaps that budgetary contingency, I think are all really important.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, that you make. Many of these laws mention reasonable progress. And I know that's sort of an open term, but as you just mentioned, LaShawn, if you're making reasonable progress and you have a long-term plan that's documented, and it's moving you towards eliminating these unlawful pay disparities, you're in pretty good shape. So we don't want to give you the impression that you need to wave the magic wand today and solve this problem overnight.
Right. I think it's our ongoing due diligence that's going to make a huge difference.
Right.
Maybe huge is too big of a word. Let's just say that will make a difference.
Reasonable. Reasonable difference, yeah.
Reasonable difference, yes.
Yeah. Okay, and then here's another question that we've gotten a couple of times. What evidence should be kept to verify that an appropriate review of pay equity has been conducted?
Is that one for me?
That's one for you.
Okay, thank you. It'll sound a little bit repetitive, but again, going back to looking at our policies, starting there, what is our organizational approach to compensation? What role does compensation play in our organization, and what do we say about it? You know, one of the things that we have to look at as HR professionals when we're talking about these policies, and maybe professionals in any category, but certainly when we're talking about HR policies that affect all employees, we have to consider, you know, what are we, how are we complying with our own policies? Many times court cases are lost because organizations didn't comply with their own policies. So we want to start by really understanding from an organizational and leadership perspective, how do we see compensation and what role does it play? And then how do we share expectations with employees about what they can expect regarding not just beginning pay, but how does pay grow over the years, and how will decisions be made about performance, or if there are merit systems, seniority, all of those things that we've talked about. So we want to have a record of our policies and procedures and practices and how those are equitably applied. This is why we talked earlier too about the importance of training decision makers, people who are in the organization and hold positions where they can make decisions about pay. We want to make sure that they understand how to do that, because if decisions are being made about assigning pay and we're not reviewing each of those to make sure that they are equitably applied, it may be that down the road we make that discovery and then it becomes an organizational problem. So we want to have that documentation. We think that these records should be comprehensive, and they should be sources that clearly document all the steps that have been taken throughout the review. So when we're doing the review, we're going to look at salaries, we're going to look at positions, we're going to look at policies for performance management. And throughout these reviews, we're going to show what actions have been taken to address these gaps. We're going to show, again, as you said a little bit ago, Vicki, it's really important for us, for organizations, to just be able to show the steps that they've taken and how they are working toward keeping all of these things in place. So all of the records that will show the steps that have been taken to review pay, address pay, develop and maintain and update policies around pay, and to show that organizations are looking to ensure that all of these things are being applied equitably would be really important to retain, not only to be able to satisfy complaints, but also to be able to keep us as professionals on task for how to continue to work toward maintaining pay equity within our organization.
Yes, well said. Okay, to be mindful of everybody's time, we are going to close the webinar, understanding that we've given you just a taste of the topic. We have a number of excellent questions that we'll be responding to, probably posting our responses, or emailing our responses to you, so that we can help you continue the conversation in your own organizations, and we hope to help you from there. So thank you very much for
participating and attending the webinar. Thank you, LaShawn, for your excellent presentation, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.